up to that. How are you guys doing? Good. Stand-up routine over here. So here's what I'm going to do. I spent some time with I don't think with you guys, because you're the senior students, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't see any of you, I don't think, today in classes, but what I did talk a little bit about today was the importance and the power of story. And what kept coming up was talk about how stories actually work, which is always kind of a mystery, ironically, in schools, right? Because as I'm sure I have to do at my IB school that I teach at, and also at university. When we talk about stories, we often are talking about author's context, stylistic devices, all these sorts of things. Is this sort of ringing a bell?
Yeah.
A little bit. You have to do all this dry stuff. All that is obviously certainly important. We need to know those things to do well on exams and your analysis of authors and whatever novels you're reading, for example, in class. But oftentimes, at least I find, what happens is you don't actually know what the author does or why they do it or how a story is put together. So what we hear about, what we talk about most of the time is, well, they grew up in Burma in 1936, or I guess you don't grow up in 1 year, but anyway, sorry, in the 30s. And this is why they wrote this novel, and they just wrote it, or they made this movie or whatever. But we don't really spend any time figuring out why, which is super important, actually, that you have this information, this tool in your toolkit, so to speak, so you know exactly how these things work. The interesting thing today I learned was that the grade 9s, I believe, are, yes, I think I've got that right, we're studying the Odyssey. Read the Odyssey, yes?
Yes.
Pretty awesome, right? Maybe not. By the way, if you want a pretty great version of the Odyssey, there's a movie called Brother, Where Art Thou, which is kind of a neat interpretation of it. It has George Clooney in it. It's pretty cool. Anyway, the idea is, what's interesting about it for me from a story standpoint is that really pretty much everything we know about, or that you know, even though you don't know, you already know how stories work. And stories that we deal with in Western society primarily have been dealing with. What we understand as a story goes way back to the Greek myth structure, Aristotle. These guys basically laid this thing out the way it is, how we work. And almost every story kind of uses the same structure. So what I'm going to do tonight is give you a little sort of crash course in how stories are put together. If you really want to talk about my movie star friends and so forth, we can do that afterwards. It's probably not as useful to you, practically speaking, however. But I'll be happy to share some kooky stories. If you know who Stanley Kubrick is, for example, I could tell you a lot of bizarre stories about him. Pretty bizarre gentleman, but anyway. Make sense?
Yes.
So far? Okay, so first off, everything you did today or are doing right now, believe it or not, is a story. Every paper you write, believe it or not, every dry research paper, I say dry because I mean that it's not typically understood as a story. No one's paying $7.50 at a movie house to read your research paper, probably. Although if you pull that off, let me know. That would be amazing. But everything you do is, believe it or not, a story. You're living a story today. Your whole day is a story. So how many of you have heard of Carl Jung? So a couple people, Carl Jung fans in the room. So Carl Jung, sociologist, philosopher, stated that the way we think of stories, the way that I'm going to explain this to you tonight, is the way we see the day, right? So stories usually work in what are considered three acts. So you've probably heard this before, a 3-act structure, right? So there's the first act, which is, it's half as long as the middle act, and let's just make it easy. And the last part is, again, half as long as the middle act. So you have a short sort of first act, which is meant to, as far as young is concerned, it replicates your morning, right? You get up in the morning, you have some breakfast, do whatever you guys do in the morning, and then you go to, let's say, your first class, right? And your day actually begins, and now you have this pretty long day when you're in school. I'm assuming it feels like a long day, right? Yeah. Super long day. Like on Saturdays they go by like this, right? But anyway, so when you're at school and you're starting what you do for your day, that whole day feels probably at least twice as long as the morning, and technically it is, right? And then at the end, the final part of the day in the evening, we sort of wind down, wrap it up, and probably before you nod off, you sort of do a little calculation of how the day went. Maybe you have a great day, maybe you have a boring day or whatever, but there's usually some sort of summing up that you do, which in a sense is like a conclusion. Jung argued that that's just how your minds work, and which is why, for example, when stories are presented this way, that's why they're satisfying, because you just inherently are kind of wired this way, right? So most stories that you are familiar with work on this same principle. So there's one major thing I want you to think about before you, if you think, I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff at you in rapid succession. I'm going to show you an example of how it works. But one thing you should understand before you walk out, or excuse me, by the time you walk out, that makes more sense. If there's only one thing you pull away from here, is the idea of something called a dramatic question. We're going to go over this in a second, but every story has one of these, right? Every story you've ever read, seen on TV, or even your friend says, geez, you're not going to believe what happened to Jim this weekend. Whenever someone tells you this story, you immediately want to know, like, what happened, right? You want to know the answer to this story. Every story you've seen on TV, movies, whatever, comic books, delivers one of these questions. It's the same thing when you write research papers or essays or assignments for class. You are actually answering a question. So if you learn one thing, and that's all, you'll be ahead of the game. And you can apply what we're going to do here, strangely enough, to things like research papers or otherwise, quote-unquote, boring writing. Sorry for any of the academic writing teachers in the room. I teach academic writing to graduate students at the University of British Columbia who should know how to write at their point in their lives, but they don't, so I know quite a bit about writing, having them write sort of from the ground up, quote-unquote boring research papers. But it's the same principle I teach them. I try to make sure, please make sure you have a question that we want the answer to by the end. And that's all you do with your writing. It's going to improve a whole lot. That's a very specific term there. So. All right, so far so good?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Oh, he's very enthusiastic. Okay. So stories usually start off kind of like this. So I have two slides up here that I'm going to just sort of go through. Trust me here, we're going to go through it fairly quickly. Then I'm going to sort of kind of truncate an episode of an old TV show called the Twilight Zone. Anyone ever hear of this program? Yes. Old black and white show, made and created well before I was even born, so it's pretty ancient. But I think it's going to be a pretty good example of what we do. But you can use this for anything. And again, the crazy thing is you can use these same principles for writing academic work. Same things apply. So. Ignore that thing where it says prologue optional, because we could talk about that, but we don't really have time for this. So every story pretty much starts with what your English teacher calls exposition, right? Anybody remember what exposition is? So it's more of a, you say yes and tell me back what it is. Who said that awesome? Who said that awesome yes? Perfect, what is it?
No. It wasn't.
All right, I'll tell you what it is. Exposition is all the stuff, the ground setting, the rule-setting groundwork that a story has to do at the beginning, right? Here's a story about a guy or a girl who works on a farm, and they do this stuff, and this other guy lives there. Whatever the rules of the story are set up in the exposition. But screenwriters, for example, or creative writers, oftentimes call this the normal world, right? I always joke with my students that what this means is like what happens on a Tuesday at 1 o'clock, just normal stuff. So every story has to do sort of some of this business before they get going. We need to introduce characters, hopefully our main character. If there are any particular rules to your story, we need to sort those out, whatever those are. If you have a story about some knucklehead that lives on a desert planet and whines a lot, you're probably writing Star Wars, and we need to know how it works, right? So we do that first. So once you've got that established, and by the way, this is the same thing if you write a research paper. If you are establishing that there is a certain watershed in an area, and you want to know what happens when there are large rainfall amounts, and it sounds like a pretty crazy good paper so far, I think. You would establish what happens normally in this environment that you are going to analyze with some scientific data and number crunching and so forth, right? So what happens is everything is normal, and then something out of the ordinary happens. Who knows what? Little Jimmy is coming home from school. We've just spent a few pages learning about his life. And then, I don't know, a black car comes careening around the corner, and out of the window flies a bag. He goes and checks it. It's $1 million, all in unmarked bills, whatever the hell those are. You always hear that term. But anyway, something out of the ordinary happens. And now we have a question, like, whoa, where did this money come from? Or sometimes, as it is framed oftentimes in myth structure, it's a call to adventure. Somebody calls out our main character and says, hey, come here, buddy. Can you do this thing for us? The village is experiencing a drought or a disease or something. Will you go across the mountains, fight off this dragon, and get the elixir that will save your lives, that sort of thing, right? This is how pretty much every story you've ever heard of works. Somebody gets a job to do, and we want to find out if they can pull it off. Make sense?
Yes.
All right. Or sometimes something happens to someone that they don't like and that they have to now try to sort out. Right? All right. So you see this thing called refusal. Not necessary, but if you are keen to write creatively, this is often a good little tool to have in your back pocket. Hopefully this thing is dangerous, and they don't want to do, normal people shouldn't want to do it, or it should be unpleasant, or whatever. So we'll have somebody sometimes in the story go, no, I'm not doing that, that's crazy, right? Just so you know what that is. So maybe they resist for a while, and so far it's understood that our characters should be able to just leave and go back to whatever they're doing, which we saw them before doing back in the normal world, and everything's fine. Except we've got this thing over here called a point of no return. Something happens when now they're stuck. So this is the moment when you're in the movie theater, although probably you guys don't go to a lot of movies here, it's probably more difficult, but this is the part when you're watching a movie on your phone or in the theater that you know what the movie's about. You're like, oh, okay, got it. He's got to go get that thing from that guy, and then there's that other thing that's happening, whatever, right? So it's the point where when I'm in the movie theater, I've eaten all my popcorn, and I've settled in, and now I'm going, okay, got it. Now I know what's happening. So I often say this is where the story actually begins. And that sums up your first act, right? So we're a third of the way through, practically. And now whatever happens, whatever that situation is, now we're in our second act. So the second act is a funny thing. It's all about conflict. It's all about stuff happening. John, right?
Yes.
So John here, let's say, gets up for school today, and he wants some breakfast. Comes down to the dining hall, gets some breakfast. What'd you have for breakfast this morning?
I don't remember.
You should look into that short-term memory loss. Well, we're going to say you have waffles. Which I don't know if you have waffles. Anyway, he had delicious waffles. Apparently, scarce supply here. Anyway, so he has some waffles. Everything's good. Goes to class. Believe it or not, that's part of that's part of the story. It's kind of a lame story. Sorry, John. But if John wants something, does something to get it, gets it, it's kind of our whole story, right? Stories are about people wanting to either go towards something or to go away from something. They're never about anything else. It's either someone loving something, I want more of that, or being afraid or disliking something, I want less of that. But John says...
Did I want the waffles or to go to class?
Well,
you
hang
got
on.
me in a box here.
Neither, actually. So let's say John got his waffles, end of story, gets his waffles, pretty lame story. Because there's no conflict, right? We need conflict to make a story work. We need to put some stuff in John's way. So John instead gets up this morning and goes, you know what? I'm kind of jonesing for some waffles. I'm going to go down to the dining hall. But on his way, of course, there's a swarm of locusts. And the ground opens up and the zombies pour out. And Mr. Muller comes over and demands that he do some horrible thing, like I can't imagine what. But anyway, we have some conflict now. Now we have a story. Make sense?
Yes.
So conversely, even in a research paper, you now have your version of conflict. Right? You have now, so we have the question of the very amazing paper I suggested about the, what did I say, of the watershed, right? So now we want an answer to these questions that aren't easily sorted out. So the researchers did this and they came up with some conflicting data, some conflict, and now we have to go through a series of experiments to show our data and come up finally in the end with our research question answer, right? So it works the same way, but we're going back to our little drama here. So second act, we start our second act and it's all conflict, it's all stuff happening. But what we have right after this person gets stuck in the story is half of our second act is all about checking out this new world. There's crazy stuff happening in this new world, right? If I can go back to that tired example I just used with Star Wars, for example, it's like when Luke, you guys seen Star Wars Luke Skywalker? Okay, right. So you may remember Luke's parents not his parents, his aunt and uncle get barbecued by the stormtroopers. And now he doesn't have anything to do, so he has to go with the creepy old man to Alderaan or wherever, right, they're going. So what happens immediately after he leaves with the creepy old man? They go to a bar. They go to a bar and the old man chops the guy's arm off and there's weird people and there's all this kooky stuff, right? So that's what happens in the first part of the second act of your story. You have a character investigating a new situation. Like, wow, it's crazy. This thing happened to me. I'm stuck in this new world and I got to do all this stuff, right? Hopefully stuff they're unaware of. So far, you can do that for a good, in the case of movies, that's in the first part is 30 pages, next part, another 30 pages. So you've spent some time having fun. If you're a creative writer, this is where you have fun and show all the crazy stuff that happens in the world. All right, we're halfway through. I'm going to show you an example of how this actually works. So, in the middle, that's all a good time and so forth. We need to cleave this thing in two. We've had enough fun, we got to wrap this thing up. So what happens is we have what's called a midpoint, quite appropriately stuck in the middle of the story. And usually this is where, after your character's had a good time checking out the new world and crazy stuff, something happens that bums them out a little bit. So an emotional low point for your character. They're not having a good time. They just learned some bad news. It's almost always some sort of truth is revealed. In James Bond movies, you find out that the guy you thought was a good guy is the bad guy. And he's been screwing over James Bond or whatever, right? Doing something, and you find out, what, is this happening? Right. So you have this midpoint, and now they figured it out. Oh no, now, and then you figured it out too. So now the solution that they have to figure out to sort themselves out is sorted. And now it's just all about going after this thing. I totally forgot about your story here. You've got your, so everything's good. Anyway, so now it's all, I know what the goal is. I got to get to the bank by 2 o'clock or the whole world blows up, or whatever your story is. Right? So everything goes along. Your character's doing their thing. They're trying to win the race or win the game or whatever your character wants to do or avoid or go toward. We're almost there, light at the end of the tunnel, they're almost going to make it, but what do? Something really horrible happens, and it's obviously all over. There's no way they can win. the game is lost or down 100 points in a basketball game, which would be a lot of points, but nothing's going to happen. But then you know what happens, John?
Somebody gets back up.
Somebody does get back up. Somebody has an idea so crazy it just might work. So somebody comes up with something, or there's some 1 in a zillion chance for a solution, and then that's the thing they go, all right, let's do this. It's so stupid, but whatever, it's all we've got.
They open Paddock now.
And then that takes us into our last part of our story, Act 3. And why are we here for Act 3? What did I say at the beginning? Why are we reading your research paper? Yeah, the answer to the question, right? The whole time, you see this little So we get to the end, the climax where all the stuff happens, Death Stars blow up, Romeo and Juliet die, all this sort of thing, right?
So good.
And now we get our question answered. Will so and so do something? Yes or no, right? So, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, the whole question is, will they live happily ever after? Sadly, no. They have the bad luck of being in a Shakespeare play, and if you're in a Shakespeare play, you have to die. But it's good for us. Our question is resolutely resolved for us. We know the answer, and now we can go on with our business. And we have a little weeping at the end there. Everything settles back down, and we're done, right? So we get to the end of our story, and we get our answer, right? Because that's what we're here for the whole time. Just like in your research paper, we get an answer to our research question. It's the same thing. You can write your research paper just the same way that, I don't know, George Lucas wrote Star Wars. It's doing the same thing. You're all predisposed. All of us are predisposed to want an answer for something. That's what drives us, right? That's the very thing that we're always trying to figure out. That's why we like stories, right? We want to know a question and how something resolves. And hopefully we apply that information to our own lives, right? There you go. You get a whole term's worth of stuff in like, whatever that was, 12 minutes. So I'm going to show you an example and kind of go through how it works, all right?